Greetings, lovers of lore. Thank you for joining me for this installment of the Dominaria United storyline. This part focuses on the Weatherlight and its crew, but does not include the story about Karn and Jaya. It is a separate but equally interesting addition to the overall world. Now, we are starting out on the actual ship Weatherlight. And if you're not familiar with the history of this is part of Urza's legacy that was used to destroy the Phyrexian menace. A ship that was grown out of living magical wood with a nature spirit imbued into it. And it was grown around Thran metal that literally grows with the ship. So it's an organic being, and it was instrumental in the previous Phyrexian invasion. So we find ourselves on the Weatherlight with its new crew. And things have changed with the Weatherlight. What happened was the crew went out and located at painstaking cost pieces of Phyrexians until they had enough that they could cloak the Weatherlight in all of these Phyrexian bits. As a result, though, unfortunately, the Weatherlight is actually undergoing changes. And Tiana is having a conversation with Shauna about this, saying that the strain is being put on the crew is immense as a result of this. The Phyrexian pieces are actually corrosive and are damaging the Weatherlight. But Shanna says that it's necessary, and if we didn't have this sort of cloaking, that we would have already been shot down 5 times already. And the coalition needs us and needs the Weatherlight. This is how we're able to hide from Sheoldred and move in and out of her territory. Now, Tiana shoots back that the coalition needs the Weatherlight more than anything. And at this point, the motivator rods are cracked. And while they're having this conversation, the Weatherlight suddenly careens to the right. Apparently, their disguise has failed. It doesn't happen often, but it does occur. So they rush up to the deck and see that the helmsman who was steering the ship has already been downed. But luckily, Raf Capuchin has grabbed the wheel and is steering the ship. So Shanna calls out to him, "What's happening?" And he explains that he thinks it's a bone dragon. And what happened was just a result of that bone dragon's voice weapon. So Shanna instructs Raf, "Take us higher." And the dragon levels another blast of its voice weapon. At that point, they're able to spot it. It's a wicked monstrosity unlike anything they had previously seen. It was entirely skeletal, except its wings were normal dragon membranes. As they approached, it cast volleys of crimson lances at the Weatherlight, which they were barely able to dodge. And at the same time, they fired back a powerbolt barrage. But the skeletal dragon looked like it would be slow. Instead, it was actually quite agile and zipped out of the way. So Shauna bellowed, "Wrath, bring us closer!" And as they did so, the dragon fires more of these lances at the Weatherlight, and Wrath slams off to the left, hard to dodge, but unfortunately, one of the lances tears into the starboard wing, setting it on fire. But in return, the Weatherlight was able to line itself up in a way where it could fire a bunch of power bolts, and they blasted one of the wings off of the dragon. And at that point, the dragon immediately plummeted from the sky. Whatever magic allowed it to fly failed if it didn't have both wings. There was no time to celebrate, however, as the Weatherlight's wing was severely damaged and they needed to land immediately. So Raf tilted the ship and they banked downwards, barely making it in time. Turns out, after looking at the environment they were in, they had landed in Otaria. So Shauna turns to Tiana and says, "How long is it going to be until we can take off?" Tiana looks pretty grim. She says, "We can't, actually. Half the moderator rods are cracked completely now. And if we were to try and fly again at this stage, the Power Stone would overcharge and blow the entire Weatherlight to bits." Shanna, obviously being massively frustrated by this, says, "Do we not have any spares?" And Tiana said, "Those were the spares. I've been begging you to do repairs for months." They were well and truly stuck until Raf actually felt some sort of magical emanations in the area and came to the conclusion that that dragon must be here because it was guarding something. So Shauna, Tiana, and Raf all set off together to investigate the source of the magic, leaving Arvad the vampire in charge of the Weatherlight. On their way to investigate what the dragon was guarding, they encounter a dome of oily black smoke, and it's cracking and roiling, and one of them picks up a rock and whips it into the smoke, and instead of passing through it, it actually bounces off as if the smoke is solid, and the rock starts to sizzle and burn. So Raph at that point goes, we need to try something stronger, and whips some fire magic out of his hands directly at it. The oily smoke just eats the fire magic like it's nothing. So at that point, they're forced to reevaluate their options again. And it's put forth that since Shanna has an immunity to pretty much all magic, that maybe she could just walk through it. That idea was quickly discarded as they considered the fact that Shanna could immediately be vaporized and it wasn't worth risking her life. But it turned out that just being in the vicinity of this black smoke was bad enough because Shanna felt her magic nullification take effect, but this time it left a sour taste in her mouth. Something was off. It wasn't like a normal magic nullification. So they all decided they were going to move backwards away from this oily dome. But at that moment, howling darkness, tornadoes of rainbow light come swirling up out of the dome, and they form into something human-like, a being with dozens of braids and a set of goggles and tons of little shadowy hands snapping out of the body, and for some weird reason, no feet at the bottom. The being spoke. You're lucky you didn't try to go through that barrier. You would have been vaporized right away. Didn't anybody tell you not to mess with dangerous magic? Raph was on the defensive immediately. Stay back! He pulls up patterns of light magic on his hands, but they're instantly snuffed out by this stranger who introduces themselves as Braids. So, obviously the question becomes, Braids, were you the one who made that dragon that attacked us? And Braids explained, no, actually what happened was a crazy Phyrexian war construct was coming by, and it just happened to tear the roof off of the horde grave that belonged to that bone dragon. And the bone dragon just got all riled up and flew into the sky and attacked, so it actually had nothing to do with the Phyrexian menace itself. Tiana was focused on the fact that there was a Phyrexian construct nearby. If they could get their hands on the parts that were inside that construct, they could use them to repair the Weatherlight and get airborne again. So Braids said, I'll make you a deal. I will help you get in there where the construct is. If you help me, kill me. They agreed, but were very confused. So they headed onwards. When they reached the magical barrier, Raph laments that it's never a situation where they encounter a regular door and he can just use lockpicks. Braids goes on to explain that she has split herself in two and she needs to swallow her other half back inside herself. So at this barrier, Braids picks up a handful of dirt, throws it into the barrier, and it starts to sizzle and heat up. And she explains that her shard self is going to be guarded by a bunch of nightmares equivalent to what she can summon up herself. As she's saying that, a number of shadow spears whip out of Braids' body into the barrier. It starts sizzling, and then the barrier emits an inhuman scream, and 4 different pathways open up. Braids explains, you're heading into your own nightmares. You might go mad. Pretty exciting, huh? Don't go together, though. Your brains might leak out. All 4 of them make their separate way into their own paths, and Shanna is immediately thrust into darkness. She walks in darkness for a while, and things resolve themselves into the Weatherlight. And not just the Weatherlight, but Sisay, her ancestor, is also there, the original captain of the Weatherlight. But she's not happy to see Shanna. In fact, she blames Shanna. Look what you've done to the Weatherlight. And saying that, she takes her dagger and she drives it into the Weatherlight's wood. And where she pulls it away, Phyrexian corruption and oil leak directly out all over the floor, spattering. And Shanna is just filled with shame, trying to fight back against her worst fears here, right? The corruption is overwhelming her. She wants to fight to save the world like the real Sisay, and that's what she says. But the imposter Sisay comes back with the difference is that you failed. Sisay lost the Weatherlight to destroy Yawgmoth and to save Dominaria. You used the Weatherlight for running errands. You're a coward. Sisay continued to taunt her. And then Sisay's mouth opened wide and nightmares issued forth. Every single person that Shauna loved was dead in some horrific way or turned into a Phyrexian monstrosity, mechanical parts jutting from their bodies, their will subsumed. Shauna screamed out, "No!" and started to smash the nightmare with her sword over and over. Raw, brute force. No technique, no style, just fear, rage, and pain until it was obliterated into a pile of nothingness. She continued down the pathway for another half an hour until abruptly she was suddenly back in reality. And before her, there was a half-sunken Phyrexian war machine that was struggling to free itself. She could hear its machinery creaking. She looked around and spotted Raph and Tiana, and they gathered together and discussed their experiences. It turns out that each of them was actually in the nightmare world for a different amount of time. For Tiana, it had been brief minutes. But for Raph, it had actually been hours. There was a thrum in the air, and abruptly, shadow braids faded into existence, looking all shadowy and watery and wrong. Shadow Braids was angry. "I will let you leave, but that's just because I'm surprised that you survived these nightmares, and I want to see if you can make it back out, because I don't think you will. And if you don't go, I'm just going to kill you." And as she's saying that, shadows are forming from the barrier and they start to coalesce. But instead of being some kind of summon, it's actually the original Braids, who points at Shadow Braids and says, "Come back or I'll break you." At that point, Shadow Braids becomes really desperate. "You're being used," she says to Shauna and the others. And at the same time, starts flinging these cubes of black magic as Shauna's, they're just ping, 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 breaking off of her magical immunity. But that's a half distraction because Shauna's trying to run forward to take down Shadow Braids. But all of a sudden, she is in front of Raph now with her hand on his face, and he's mid-spell frozen in abject terror as Shadow Braids is deep in his mind at that moment. So Shauna charges her again, but at this point, Shadow Braids feeling pretty smug, dodges out of the way again with no problem. But there actually is a problem because Tiana was coming from behind. Unexpected angelic action gets into Shadow Braids, and because of her angelic nature, it burns in Shadow Braids. But the shadowy version is still pretty slick, so she turns around and sprays darkness at Tiana's face. But at the last minute, it is diverted because now she's no longer in Raph's mind, right? So Raph's unfinished spell finishes at the last moment and protects Tiana from the dark magic. Raph then leaps away and Shauna jumps forward, impaling the Shadow Braid. The real Braid comes down from the ceiling and her throat opens up into a void that pulls the Shadow Braid and the entire shadow void around them straight into her. In the blink of an eye, there were no shadows and it was all done. Shauna looked at Braids. "It was that easy?" Braids gave her a look. "No, I was holding her back. You would all be dead." Tiana was shaken. She had always wondered what dreaming was like. As an angel, she never actually dreamt. Now that she knew what nightmares actually were, she said to herself, "It might be better to never have a dream if it means that I avoid nightmares like this." So at this point, Braids agrees that she's going to live up to her deal and will help them repair the Weatherlight. So they start to make their way back to the Weatherlight. But on their way, they can see some lamps up ahead bobbing. Some people are running. At the head of some of the Weatherlight crew is Arvad, but he should be with the Weatherlight. So Shauna says, "What are you?" Before she can even finish though, sickly green power bolts start slamming into the ground all around her, setting the trees on fire. Shauna is barely missed. Raph throws up a protective spell just in time. Arvad grunts, he's been hit, but at the same time he's a vampire, so he's going to be okay. But the same can't be said for the two crew members that were with them. They get melted by the power bolts. And this amuses Braids because Braids is literally a crazy person. She starts cackling about how they melted like wax. And the Weatherlight is there, bobbing just above the ground, but it looks all wrong. Its body now is knotted, gross muscle, and there are these cables hanging down from it like rotting intestines, and there's just ooze dripping down, spattering from it, and just an unhealthy feel to the Weatherlight. It's been fully turned into a Phyrexian vessel. Its organic elements have succumbed to Phyres. The Weatherlight is now a tool of Phyrexia. Looking up at the flying corpse that was the Weatherlight, Shauna asked Arvad, how did this happen? It turns out the Phyrexian corruption had finally made its way to the engine room and spread to the rest of the ship fully as a result. How do we bring it down, Tiana? Braids interjected, no, you want to stop this now? This is so much fun. Tiana looked at Shauna. The only way we're going to be able to stop the Weatherlight is to remove its power stone. You could see sadness in her eyes. Now, the Weatherlight had just recently been converted, and it hadn't fully acclimatized to its new state of being. So it wasn't able to fly properly, and it wasn't able to use its weaponry properly. And that's the only thing that saved Shauna and Tiana as they charged up to it. The Weatherlight couldn't fly away, and it also couldn't get a good bead on them with its weaponry. So they managed to make it up to the hull, and Tiana uses her angelic blade to just slice through the corrupted hull like it's nothing. And rotten ichor, Phyrexian grossness, is just slopping down upon them as they step through this hole. The inside of the Weatherlight has been transformed. It's all mossy, disgusting flesh, and embedded in it, there are these gross mouths, and in the middle of those mouths, in the center of the teeth, are hideous, bloodshot eyes. There are spikes sticking out of the wall. A bunch have impaled crew members. The Thran metal is no longer gleaming. It's all black and acid etched. The only thing that remained pure within the Weatherlight was the Power Stone. And when they arrived where the Power Stone is housed, they found that Slimefoot was still alive. He was half burnt and clinging to the top of the Power Stone. There were 3 animated spikes with heads on them that had protruded from the wall of the Weatherlight, and they were all stabbing at Slimefoot, trying to get at the Power Stone. Shauna charged in, and the 3 spikes turned to her in unison. The heads on the spikes were all parts of her crew that she remembered, and their names came to her mind. And as they did, they spoke to her. They said, "You left us to die, Captain." And then their heads whipped in viper quick, and they all licked her neck in a way that to her felt worse than acid and fire combined. But she managed to cut them all down. After that, they were able to successfully remove the Power Stone and check and see that Slimefoot was okay. As they made their way back towards the outer hull of the Weatherlight to escape, they encountered no more resistance, which they took to mean that the spirit of the Weatherlight was still somewhat fighting against the Phyrexian corruption, trying to buy them time to escape. But unfortunately for them, Tiana chose that moment to have an absolute breakdown. What kind of angel am I? She's so bonded with the Weatherlight that this to her is a massively personal situation. She feels that this all happened because she didn't do a good enough job taking care of the Weatherlight, and leaving it behind is something she's just not prepared to do. But ultimately, they all end up leaping off of the Weatherlight, and just at the right moment, as the Phyrexian essence had just started to fully take hold, and the Weatherlight was moving further up in the air and started to fly away. Shauna looked on filled with despair as Dominaria's greatest hope faded into the distance. And that ends this installment of the Dominaria United lore. The Weatherlight has been Phyrexianized. This is one of the most insane things that's ever happened in Magic lore. This is amazing. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks for coming by. There's more lore coming. If you enjoy what we're doing here, then join the channel membership or support us on Patreon. It makes a big difference. I'll see you all for the next installment of the story. And remember, my friends, lore is life.